Hello everyone, and welcome to today's Google Hangout. I'm Alistair Horn from Cambridge English Teacher, and today I'm joined by Nicky Hockly, who's your Cambridge English Teacher consultant for technology. We're going to be discussing over the course of the next half hour using mobile phones to support language learning. So mobile phones and tablets are now an established part of everyday life. But despite that, they're often dismissed as distractions to learning and often even banned from the classroom. But these devices can actually be really useful for providing opportunities to learn. And Nicky's going to be talking much more about the opportunities that these devices bring. So while we're waiting for you all to join us, how are you, Nicky?
I'm fine, thank you. I'm sitting here in Barcelona in Spain, where it's another beautiful sunny day. We have these lovely clear winter days here. I'm very lucky.
Excellent. I think here in Cambridge, just looks out the window, it's getting dark already, and but I don't think it's raining at the moment. So
that's good news.
Progress.
Yeah, I remember when I lived in the UK, I lived there for 6 years, and I just never got used to these dark, long afternoons in the winter that by 4:30, it's pretty much black outside, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's very depressing in the winter. But, you know, at least in the summer in Britain, the rain is warm, which is progress.
Yes, I have a friend who always says when he's in Britain and it's summertime, he says, "Oh, summer, it's a lighter shade of grey."
Excellent. We've got people joining us now. So shall we start with a question that came in via the event page, which is very interesting. I'm afraid I wasn't able to read the Arabic script of the name of the person who suggested this, so my apologies for that. But it's a very pertinent question, I think. How can we utilize smart devices in demotivated environments?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think one of the things that research has found with smart devices, or not necessarily smart devices, but mobile devices, by which I mean phones, which could be basic low-end phone or smartphones, and tablet devices. One thing that research has found is that it can affect motivation positively. So for students who are demotivated, depending on what you do with them, of course, I think the first thing we need to establish is that it's not really about the technology. Technology can be used effectively and ineffectively, and that goes for any kind of technology, any kind of device. But if you can find motivating things for students to do with devices, then it can certainly, enhance what they're doing and make them a little bit more interested in classroom stuff that you do.
Okay, thanks. Got a question now on distraction from Philip Middleton. Philip says that he teaches adults, but often finds that students are posting to Facebook, checking Instagram instead of paying attention to the class. How do you get around? How do you get the students sufficiently motivated so that though they've got their phones there, this source of distraction, they're actually doing what you need them to do in the class?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it's a concern of a lot of teachers. It's sometimes less of a concern for teachers of adults who we expect to be, kind of responsible and, if you like, well behaved in class, although of course that is not always the case. But it's certainly a concern that I've heard from secondary school and primary school teachers. But going back to Philip's context, he's talking about adults. I think I've used smart devices with students, and the groups that I've used them with fairly low level in terms of language level, so with beginners and with lower intermediate students, and with adults. The youngest in my class were 16 to 18, and then we had up to, mid-40s. In terms of distraction, I think there are two things to keep in mind, two things that can help. The first one is kind of classroom management, basically. So the way I was teaching, in my case, was the students were using their own devices. They had their own smartphones and their own tablets, and we were using that for a number of activities in the class. What I found worked quite well was to say to the students, okay, now we're doing X, activity such and such, and I need you to take out your devices, take out your phones, take out your tablets, and do it. So I'd give the instructions, they'd take out their phones, they'd do whatever it is we were doing, and then I would ask them to, when we were finished, to either turn the device face down, so if it's a phone, face down on the desk in front of them, or if it's a tablet, something like this, just to close the screen, and then I could easily see that the students weren't looking at their devices. Because I think that's the real challenge. When you're using devices and they're doing fun, interesting stuff, it's extremely difficult to get students' attention back again.
Yes.
And I found that this works, that in fact, I think classroom management in a situation where students have mobile devices is easier than if you go to something like a computer room. So by computer room, I mean like a room where you have these fixed rows of desktop computers, which some schools and some universities do have. My experience of classroom management in that is that you're standing at the front normally, the students are doing something, maybe they're looking online for information or whatever it may be, and you're faced with this row of computers. You can't see the screen. You start to walk around the side of the class to see what they're looking at. And by the time you get level with the student, they've closed down the window of the Facebook group and they've got the page that they're supposed to be looking at up. It's absolutely impossible. I mean, apart from that, just the whole rapport I find is affected very much in a computer room, because you have these huge kind of, these blocks. It would be like me doing a webinar with you like this the whole time. It's very, very difficult to connect. So again, I think actually classroom management with devices is easier if you have those kinds of things, if you like, in place. So that's one area, classroom management. And the other area, I think, is task design. So if the tasks that you're getting them to do are interesting and engaging enough, and they also have a limited time in which to do the thing, then they're going to do it. So let me give you a really simple example. Let's say we have a task. Students, we get them into pairs and we give them a list of photos. They need to open up their photo album on their phone where they keep their own photos. And then they need to find in pairs an example of, for example, a pet. Let's say Alistair and I are working together. Alistair, we both, between us, we look for one of us, has a picture of a pet. We show the other one. I tell you a little bit about it, you ask me some questions, and then we go to the next thing on the list, which might be, a parent or a child. The next thing might be a party or a celebration. The next thing might be, a photo with a view. The next one might be a selfie. You have a list of maybe 10 things and a time limit. The activity is engaging because we're talking about our own photos and we're sharing information, so it's very personalized. We have a very clear task to do with a very clear focus. It's a speaking activity, essentially. We're using our own photos as a prompt for speaking, and we have a limited time in which to do it. And when the first sort of pair, if you like, to finish, can say stop, and then everybody has to stop. And then the teacher says, okay, devices face down again. So a combination of those two things I found certainly made it fairly easy to keep students on track. But I know I'm going on about this question, Philip, sorry, but I think it's an important question. I do know other teachers, though, who, especially with long classes, so if you have, let's say, an evening class, 3 hours with a group of adults, what she does is she actually gives her students what she calls a WhatsApp break. And what they do is they have like a 5-minute break during the class, and they can all use their devices however they want. So she also teaches business people in the group. So they want to kind of be checking email. So she'll let them check email. Other people will do whatever they want to do, update their Facebook or something for those 5 minutes, and then the devices go away again. So this is another way you can handle this perhaps with adults who tend to be fairly responsible, well, depending.
Great.
I hope that answers the question.
So yes, providing an outlet for them to get what they want to get done, and then as part of the deal, they will focus for the rest of the time.
Yeah, I mean, I've never tried that myself, but I thought it sounded like quite an interesting thing to do. And if I did do that with my group of adult students, I would want to negotiate that with them. I mean, check that the majority of the class felt that this was necessary, because if it's only 1 or 2 who are doing this, then perhaps it's not necessarily, and it's a matter of them being, a little bit more responsible about what they do during class.
Okay, thanks. I've got a question in from Tessa, who I hope is in the audience with us now, who's asked about any new apps for young children, and maybe tasks around teaching young children using smartphones.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots, I'm sure, Tessa, as you know, if you're a young learner teacher, there are lots and lots of apps available, especially for kids. I mean, not language learning kids, just for kids in English. There's lots and lots of stuff. So, for learning literacy, learning how to draw, for example, there are apps where you can have a tablet with a large screen, and what you'll do is you'll have the letters on the screen, and then the kids can actually be drawing with their fingers to learn how to write, things like that. There's for listening, there's for reading, all that sort of stuff. There's plenty for what we might call native speaker children. For language learning young children, I'm a lot less familiar with that. I don't teach young children myself, although I believe that most of the publishers do have some apps. For example, I know Cambridge has an app called Word Fun World, which Alistair may be able to tell us a little about. Alistair, do you know?
Yes, so it's an app based focusing on very young learners, and quite initial to basic stuff like matching words to pictures, for instance. I'm pretty sure it's either free on the App Store, certainly for iOS, I think also for Android, and yes, worth taking a look at and seeing whether it's what you're looking for, really.
Okay, I do have another thing to suggest for very young learners. I was just remembering a teacher who I know who works in Seville here in Spain, and she teaches very young learners, aged 4 to 6. And she set up a wonderful project where they used a kind of a free game making app, which is called Tiny Tap. So tiny as in small and tap as in tap something, Tiny Tap. At that time, it was available only for the iOS, for Apple products, but it may be available now for Android. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. The idea is that it's a basic game in which you choose a number of images, templates, and then you can make your game interactive, if you like. So she got slightly older kids, aged like 9, 10, creating very simple games in this app for younger kids. And it would have things like, a picture of, some animals and so on, and some balloons. And the game consisted of giving oral prompts, spoken prompts, and the kids would have to listen and they would have to tap. So, for example, the game might say, where's the blue balloon? And then the kid would have to look at the picture and then, tap the blue balloon, and then it would get a little, well done, or and they'd have to tap another one. But they'd actually got slightly older kids making the game in English for the slightly younger kids, which was, I think, a wonderful way to use things that had been, designed for native speakers in an English language learning context.
Oh, that sounds great. I've just checked, by the way, and Word Fun World is available for Android as well, and it's particularly focused on vocabulary. Okay, moving to a somewhat older age group now. Got a question from Alenka Villavicencio, who asks, which apps would you recommend for learning English with university students?
Yeah, okay. I think I always, when I get asked about apps, I always say, well, it depends what you want to do. There's pretty much an app for everything. I've just recently, actually, just finished last week, writing a book about research into learning technologies and how far research supports claims that are made around certain technologies that they actually, help students learn English. There's been a lot of interesting research carried out into vocabulary learning, and quite a bit of that has taken place in university settings. And especially with academic type vocabulary. So one of the studies, and I can look up the reference, but I can't remember it offhand, was carried out with university age EFL learners. I think it might have been in Iran, actually. It was somewhere in the Middle East. And the research looked at giving these university students, they had two groups, a control group who just studied vocabulary through to traditional means, basically paper-based, and then they had an experimental group who was receiving a certain amount of vocabulary words via SMS on their mobile phones. And these didn't need to be fancy mobile phones. They could be just basic, SMS, vocabulary, X amount of vocabulary per week over a period of time. And the idea behind the research was to check whether, the students learned better through one medium or through the other. There have been a couple of studies carried out like this. In some cases, the results show that the students do learn better, but in other studies, pretty much very similar studies, the results are not clear. sometimes there are other factors that seem to contribute, like the amount of time students spend studying the words and so on and so forth. But it seems to me that for university students in an academic context, the one thing that they do need to learn is academic vocabulary, right? That's the one obvious thing. There are apps available that look at academic words for EFL students based on word frequency and the academic word list, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And that's the kind of thing I might be interested in giving my students if I want to give them apps. Although this is probably the point to say that for me, using mobile devices with students, certainly in my own experience, is not about apps. Apps is one part, and is something that the students can very easily do as self-study outside the classroom, and it's helpful, and they do need to memorize vocabulary, for example. But in class, I think what's interesting about mobile phones is the affordances that they have to help your classes be a little bit more creative. So we can have our students, taking photos, recording audio, recording video, looking up stuff, using them in a variety of ways. And then the app-based work can take place as kind of, self-study and reinforcement, perhaps out of class.
Yes, would you view that the affordances they offer, one of those being actually recording their own progression and providing a record for assessment and for self-assessment and sense of progression?
Exactly. Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's just so easy. I remember I've been teaching for quite a while now, like almost 30 years. And back in the old days, we would lug these huge, VHS video recorders into class. And it was just, a performance. You had to put up a tripod and it was all very scary. And of course, these days, you can just have students in pairs. If they have to prepare a presentation, let's say, to do in front of the class, they can film themselves at home. They can send it to you. You can give feedback, or they can work in pairs during class, film each other, give each other feedback, and not even have to share it with anybody, which is the great thing, because that's of course what's quite scary in a foreign language, is being filmed, and who's going to have access to this. Oh, and just one point actually about the video recording. I know in some cultures it's not considered okay for people to to do two-camera filming, and of course what you can do there is audio, so it doesn't have to be video. You've got the two choices there to make things more culturally appropriate depending in which context you're teaching.
Okay, thanks. Interesting question from Ian Paul now, who asks, what do we do about the have-nots, the students who don't have, or perhaps they just don't want a smartphone?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I was teaching this group of students I was talking about before, I was actually in Cambridge a couple of years ago, Alistair. And because of the context I was teaching in, it was a private language school over the summer, I was pretty clear that students would have devices, although I didn't know what they'd have. With a bring your own device approach, you really need to work with what students have or what they don't have. It depends, I think, on your group. If there's a big difference, let's say in the same class, in that some of the students have very expensive fancy devices and some students have very inexpensive devices, and that might be an issue for them, or no devices, then what some schools do is that they provide class sets. So by class sets, I mean that the school invests in, instead of laptops, they invest in, let's say, 10 tablet computers. Now, these don't have to be iPads. These can be, much cheaper Android, Samsung, whatever it might be, tablets. And then they have them in the school. The teacher kind of books them out for the lesson, takes them into the classroom, and then the students use those devices. It's always good as well for students to be working in pairs. I think the idea for me of having a mobile device in class is not that the student is sitting there, glued to a screen on their own for a class. They need to be providing the food, if you like, or the prompt for producing language and for doing stuff. So there's absolutely no reason why students can't be working in pairs. The other option is, of course, it depends on your context and the sort of sensitivity issue with your students, is that you could have the students with the devices sharing with those students who don't have. And you could also design for the lowest common denominator. And by that, I mean that if everybody in the class, or at least if there are enough devices in the class for pairs, you can divide very simple activities, which can be done on what are called dumb phones, or perhaps basic phones. So it might be, for example, a letter dictation, which students take down in the SMS function, and pretty much any phone can do that kind of thing. It might be an activity in which students need to take photos of certain things. Again, pretty much any phone can be used for that kind of activity. So depending on the activity you design, you sometimes don't need to have the latest, fanciest phone. In fact, you sometimes don't need, you often don't need to have the latest, fanciest devices. It's a very good question, though. Thank you.
Okay. Comment, suggestion we had from Hamid Reza on the forum page. Hamid was talking about using WhatsApp, Telegram, and creating special purpose groups. I think you wanted to say something about that.
Yes, I did. Yes, Mohammed's question was, well, basically he was talking about how he gets his students to do things with their mobile devices. And he has set up WhatsApp groups, or groups in an app called Telegram, which is a little newer than WhatsApp. But the idea is that you have a closed group and that you can share stuff via your mobile device, which might be text messages or photos or bits of media and so on. And he was talking about how his students share things like links to newspaper articles, to songs, to something else that I can't read my own handwriting, but also to things like video clips. What was that?
Lyrics, I think it was, after song.
Okay, yeah, it looks like it begins with a B, but I cannot read that. And then they use all of that information that they've shared, I think, probably out of class, things that they find that are interesting, and then they can put some of that into the assignments that they then end up writing for class. But I thought that was a really nice idea, this idea of having contact with students via devices outside of class. And I don't know if people are familiar with the app called Telegram. You're probably familiar with WhatsApp. And then we have Telegram. They're very similar. They're messaging apps which allow you to set up groups. The big advantage with Telegram, though, is that you don't need to share telephone numbers, because that's often a big concern with teachers. They'd like to use something like WhatsApp, but they don't want to be sharing telephone numbers, or the students are not keen to share telephone numbers. So it gets around all of that, if you like. There's a certain degree of privacy there that you won't get with WhatsApp. So that's I haven't tried it yet. I've had a look at it, and it looks like a really nice app to try out with students.
Okay, thanks. Question now about teaching CLIL and also teaching teens using either apps or I think more generally using mobile devices.
Yes, I see that one. That's from Anna, right?
Yeah.
Anna Capone there. Yeah, she says, yeah, what's the app would you suggest for teens? I think probably none, Anna, no app. I think as soon as we start to formalize learning through mobile devices, we tend to lose teenagers. So, there might be some games and so on that they can, vocabulary games, for example, that they could play out of class, or you could set up vocabulary games in free apps like Quizlet. I don't know if you're familiar with that, Quizlet. Quizlet, Quizlet. Quizlet allows you to make flashcards, and then these can be turned into sort of games. So you can have, matching pairs, or, odd one out, or this kind of thing. And students could make their own. So those kinds of apps, perhaps I might use. But my feeling would be, based on my experience with my 16-year-olds who I had in my group of adults, would be to try and use mobile devices for more creative purposes rather than apps. So getting the students out and about, taking photos. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have to use them only in class. It depends on your school. You might actually have devices banned in your school. I think there's a case for talking to the directors and convincing them of, how they can be used to support learning. But, obviously if they're banned, then you first need to sort that out. But in the meantime, students could be using their mobile devices out of class. So let's imagine with teenagers, you're studying a course book, and the unit is, I don't know, my city or travel or clothes or whatever it might be. You can get students to take photos related to that theme out of class. If you have a Telegram group set up with your teenagers where you don't need to share phone numbers, they could share those, and then in class you could, connect your phone up to the projector if you have one, look through all of the photos that they've shared, and then get them to describe, say, what is that? Why did I take that photo? What does it mean? It might be, let's say you're doing furniture vocabulary. In your coursebook, they could take a photo of a room in their house. That comes into the classroom. What is this room? Describe it. So it's just using the devices in a way to sort of bridge, if you like, what happens inside the classroom and and life outside the classroom very easily and without too much work or preparation involved. And it also gives you a chance to personalize the work that you're doing in a coursebook. So my very simple example of a room from your house, if it's in the syllabus that they need to study furniture vocabulary and house vocabulary, it was just a way to make it just a little bit more relevant and personalized.
Thanks. We've got a question from Lingaraj Paran, which is about teaching in areas where there isn't maybe even electricity, let alone technology. And I was looking at that and I was thinking, we've talked a lot about sort of the affordances of digital devices. Are there any suggestions you've got for, or ways that you've tried to replicate those, but without using the technology?
Yes. Sorry, I wasn't quite concentrating on your question now. I was actually reading Lingaraj's question there. Let me just. He's just saying, not having electricity. What about technology? What do we do with teachers who are not techno-friendly? I think what's interesting about mobile devices is that they've kind of jumped this geographical digital divide. So whereas before, let's say 10, 15 years ago, if you wanted to have any technology in your classroom in a low resource context, you would need to have, a computer or a computer room, or at least one computer in the school, and that would require, as you say, electricity and a certain amount of infrastructure. Whereas these days with mobile devices, you can be literally, in the middle of nowhere, and you can have a low-end mobile phone. So even in very low resource contexts, excuse me, in low resource contexts, people these days do tend to have low-end mobile phones. I'm not talking smartphones. I'm talking the very simple phones. So in terms of the technological infrastructure, you've got the technology in the classroom, and you could use some of the very simple activities that I've described so far. But Lingaraj also mentions this thing here. He says, what about teachers who are not so techno-friendly, he says. And this is another sort of digital divide, isn't it? We often think of the digital divide as being geographical, but it is a lot more than that. It can also have to do with attitudes. It can have to do with having had access to training as a teacher or not having had access. There can be digital divides within the same city, within the same school, within the same classroom. Some of your students may have access to internet, let's say, at home, and some may not. With teachers who are concerned about technology or not confident with technology, I think we need to start there with teacher training. I think there's no point in a school saying to all of their teachers, right, from tomorrow everybody has to use mobile devices in the classroom. That just setting themselves up for failure. First of all, it's not about the devices. It's not about having to use technology in the classroom. It's about having the technology available, wanting to be able to use it, and also being able to see how it might be used in a kind of pedagogically sound manner, because the technology for its own sake is, just, I think, a waste of time. I think I always, say to people, they say, you always think technology is so important and so on. And I think, well, actually, it's not that important. I think you can teach perfectly well with a stick in the sand. If you're a good teacher, you're a good teacher. You definitely don't need the latest, fanciest technology to be an effective teacher. Now, if you're teaching in a context where your students do have the latest technology or even basic technology, and they're bringing it into the classroom, the question is, okay, let's see how we might be able to use this to support learning. And it's not automatic. It has to be done in a principled way. All of the research into learning technologies basically is saying that. It's saying, yeah, okay, it works sometimes for some students in some contexts, but it depends very much on how it's used. It's never about the technology, it's about how it's used, and that can be effective or less effective.
Absolutely, thanks. I think we've got time for one more question, if that's okay.
Okay.
Speaking of, good question from Shia Calero Jambolakdian, apologies for the pronunciation there, about mixing task-based teaching with either Telegram or WhatsApp.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think this comes back to task design. So, I mean, when I'm designing a class or a project, because task-based would be project-based, I start with what the aim of the project is. So, what do I want my students to be able to do at the end? And then looking at the various steps that take me that way, I might think, okay, I could integrate some technology in at this stage. So now, this is just off the top of my head because I haven't seen this question before, but let's imagine that our project is to make our students in groups of 3 need to produce some kind of collage or presentation or something of English that they have in their environment. Okay, that's our end point. How could we do that? Well, first thing that occurs to me is that students might be going around, outside of class. This could be for, secondary school as well as adults. And they take photos on their mobile phones of any interesting uses of English that they see. Now, I live in Barcelona, in Spain, so it's not an English-speaking environment, but there is a lot of English around. And I think this tends to be the case pretty much everywhere these days. So the obvious places are, for example, advertisements in the street, those big billboards, in the metro, on the bus. You often see a few words of English in even Spanish language or Catalan language advertisements where I live. The other typical thing that I see here are names of shops. It's considered to be very fashionable to have a kind of English sounding name. And what we get a lot here is the kind of misuse of the apostrophe S on absolutely everything. So those are another example that my students could take photos of. And the other one, because I live in Barcelona, which is a touristy city, is we have a lot of language in menus. So a menu will often have, the Spanish, the Catalan, the English, the Russian, the French, the German, and there's a lot of interesting English translations in those sometimes. So students can easily take those sort of photos, and then they might share those via a Telegram group or a WhatsApp group. Then we might bring them into the classroom, comment about them, decide, how they might fit into different categories, maybe do some language correction or not. And then the students can use those photos as the basis for their product, which I would want to create some kind of digital product, probably some kind of multimedia poster online, or not, or they could print them out and do them as a paper-based poster. So to answer the question, I mean, I think it's looking at what your project is, and then how mobile devices might aid that, if at all, and then how that might work with the Telegram group, rather than starting the other way around.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Nicky. Thank you to everyone who's asked a question, whether on the Cambridge English Teacher forum page or on the event page or in the Q&A that we've had on the right-hand side of the screen as well. Thank you, everybody, and we'll finish there. Have a lovely weekend, Nicky.
Great, thank you very much, and thanks to everybody and for your wonderful questions and comments, which I'm still watching coming in here. It's been really excellent questions, and if you do use mobile devices with your students, carry on, and if you're going to try out new stuff, then good luck. And thank you, Alistair.
Thank you very much. Goodbye, everybody.